I'm Lu Yan from Beijing Review Magazine, and this is the Governance Podcast, a podcast that explores the past, present, and future of governance in China as it works toward meeting its development goals and finds its place in the global community. More than 2,400 years ago, a grueling war raged between two Greek city-states. In the view of renowned historian Thucydides, this 27-year-long conflict was attributable to the expansion of the rising power Athens and the fear it aroused in Sparta, the established power. 12 years ago, based on historical reflections, Graham Allison, founding dean of Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, coined the term Thucydides' trap to describe the tendency toward conflict between emerging and established powers. Since then, the term has been a popular lens through which to view the relationship between the U.S. and China, the world's two largest economies. Proponents claim a rising China's increasing role in the currently U.S.-led international order will eventually lead to war. But President Xi Jinping has explicitly rejected this rhetoric. Xi has said the world is big enough for the two countries to develop themselves and prosper together. Moreover, he has reiterated China's commitment to upholding the international order. In the world, there is only one international system, the international system with the United Nations at its core. There is only one international order, the international order underpinned by international law. President Xi said at the general debate of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September 2021. It is therefore clear when Xi says China upholds the international order, what he means is the basic norms governing international relations based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be observed. It is on this premise that Xi calls for reforms to make global governance fairer and more reasonable. In this episode of the Governance Podcast, we'll talk to Ma Bo, an associate professor with the School of International Studies at Nanjing University, and Evangel Menezes de Carvalho, a professor of international law at FGV Law School in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. We will also hear from Liu Jianchao, Minister of the International Department of the Communist Party of China Central Committee, which is in charge of the party's external relations. During the program, we'll hear the way he explained China's position to an audience of think tank members in New York City. Ma Bo, thank you for joining the Governance Podcast. What is your understanding of China's attitude to the international order?
China's stance is now about overthrowing the existing international order as it has benefited from it over the past 4 decades. This order includes foundational structures and principles such as the United Nations, international law, and the global trade system. Instead, China aims to amend this system to make them more inclusive and equitable, maintaining the core framework while addressing its deficiencies. This approach promotes a more balanced international system that reflects the interests of all nations, particularly developing countries.
Can you give examples of the aspects of the international system that need to be addressed? In what ways does the system lack balance and fairness?
I believe China has identified several areas within the international system it believes needs to be addressed. China advocates for the reform of institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to better reflect the economic reality of the 21st century. China feels that these institutions are currently dominated by Western countries and do not adequately represent the interests of emerging economies. Also on trade and economic policies, China supports reform to the World Trade Organization that would address perceived imbalances and unfair trade practice. China argues for the protection of developing countries' rights within the global trade system and seeks to ensure that the trade policies are fair and do not disproportionately benefit developed nations at the expense of emerging economies. This includes addressing issues like agricultural subsidies in developed countries and the protection of intellectual property rights. Last but not the least, climate change and sustainable development. China emphasized the need for more equitable climate policies that take into account the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. China argues that developed countries should take the lead in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and provide financial and technological support to developing countries. China seeks to balance its economic development needs with environmental protection, advocating for international cooperation in green technology and sustainable practice.
China's participation in international affairs has been increasing in recent decades. Its emergence as a leading voice among global South countries has led many in the developed world to speculate about China's intentions, assuming that China is orchestrating the overthrow of the current system and the establishment of a new one. However, China has largely been a beneficiary of the established UN-centered international order and has no intention of trying to replace it. But while it's strongly committed to upholding this order, China, along with many other nations, seeks to make amendments that would make it fairer. By pursuing these amendments, China hopes to promote greater balance within the international system so that it better reflects the interests of all nations, particularly developing ones. My next guest, Evangel, is a recipient of the Friendship Award, China's highest award for professionals from overseas who have made significant contributions to the country's development. Evangel, how do you see the evolution of the international order in recent decades?
Since the end of the Cold War, the world has embraced the idea of globalization with the promise of a free circulation of goods and people across borders. The emergence of the Internet as we know it and the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1990s were driving forces of this ideology and above all of the liberal economic order. The most important thing was that multilateralism was gaining ground regardless of each country's political and economic regimes, in line with the spirit of the United Nations, which does not discriminate against the states because of their government regimes and economic models. But the September 11 terrorist attacks in New York City in 2001 and the 2008 financial crisis reversed the positive expectations filled in the 1990s that seem increasingly distant now. Multilateralism has begun a retraction stage aggravated by the U.S. difficulty in dealing with China's economic rise. This scenario has led the U.S. to take protectionist and unilateralist measures that raise questions about its commitment to the economic order it once ardently defended. And this scenario continues to worsen. The U.S. began to question the rules of the international system that they had defended before. Also, since the war against Iraq in 2001, the U.S. has shown signs of privileging NATO over the United Nations when the matter is of supreme national interest and meets its demands for expansion of power. This expansion and how it is being carried out worry many countries. It suffices to note that the vast majority of if not all, countries in South and Central America, Africa and Middle East, and Asia have refused to impose sanctions against Russia in the current conflict with Ukraine, contrary to the expectations of the United States and other NATO countries. We are not saying those countries are against the United States and NATO, but they do not want a unipolar world. They disagree with submitting multilateralism to the interests of only a few powerful Western countries. So it is time to urgently rediscuss the future of the United Nations and its reform and support initiatives that strengthen multilateralism.
What are the major inequalities that exist in the current international system?
There are two main structural inequalities in the international system. The first is economic. The concentration of economic power in the hands of a few companies and developed countries significantly reduces the effective exercise of sovereignty in many poor or developing countries. Because they have fragile or almost non-existent economic sovereignty, many of these countries rely on state aid from foreign governments or external investments, which often impose draconian conditions on the governments of those poorer countries, resulting in little improvement in the living conditions of the affected population. The concept of an international system based on sovereignty equality between states is increasingly becoming a work of fiction. The second inequality is political and military. An example is the recurring preference of the United States and the United Kingdom for NATO, and no longer for the United Nations, to resolve issues that serve their exclusive national interests. The United States and the United Kingdom are showing systematic signs that the United Nations is an obstacle to overcome so that they can move forward with their national interests. If this continues, we will have an increasingly monitored and controlled international order by NATO. NATO threatens the survival of the United Nations, that is, of the global order as we understand it since the end of the Second World War.
How do Brazil and other Latin American countries view China's actions to make changes to the international order?
China has taken up the defense of the reform of international organizations such as the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. These organizations are experiencing a crisis of legitimacy and effectiveness in the 21st century. China's defense of the reform of these organizations aims to recover the role of these organizations in maintaining the stability of the international system and promoting the economic development of all countries. The Chinese government has expressed that when defending the reform of the international order, it does not intend to replace it with a completely different one, especially because China has benefited from the current international order. The scenario is entirely different from the Cold War period when two great powers at that time disputed different conceptions of the international order. That's not the case now. China has advocated a reform that strengthens its current institutions by promoting inclusive multilateralism, that is, a reform of the international order that can allow greater participation of developing countries in international decision-making processes. In other words, China advocates a democratization of the international system. However, this proposal for the democratization of the international system is met with resistance from Western powers, and precisely those who claim to be democratic. This Chinese foreign policy agenda is considered very welcome for Latin American countries. Brazil shares this Chinese vision. This fact increases the importance of BRICS Plus for strengthening multilateralism through greater democratization of international relations and having the United Nations as its core.
Notably, under the current system, the World Bank presidency is reserved for American citizens. And while the IMF is funded by 190 countries, its leadership is reserved for Europeans. Outdated rules such as these place much of the global decision-making power in the hands of a minority of countries. The desire of many developing countries for more balance within the international system arises from the fact that while more than 85% of the world's population live in developing countries, the overwhelming majority of institutions that govern the world are administered in and by developed countries. As countries develop and increase their participation in the international system, there is an increased need for these countries to have a say in how the system operates, requiring all parties to jointly seek equity. Liu Jianchao, Minister of the International Department of the CPC Central Committee, made China's position clear while speaking at the Council on Foreign Relations, an influential U.S. think tank, during a visit to the U.S. in January. Let's take a listen.
China does not seek to change the current international order, still less reinvent the wheel by creating a new international order. We are one of the builders of the current world order and have benefited from it. We'll continue to uphold the international system with the UN at its core and the international order underpinned by international law and the basic norms governing international relations.
When Liu said China is one of the builders of the current world order, he's referring to China being one of the countries that founded the UN in 1945. China is also one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council with veto power. When talking about China-US relations, Liu said he does not see any area where the two countries cannot cooperate.
If the two countries really have reasonable and correct perceptions of each other, good policies will be possible. So there's a tremendous potential for, the largest developed country in the world and the largest developing country in the world. So tremendous potentials as could be seen in our cooperation in the past. So I think the possibility and potentiality are all there. But now I think that it's really up for the United States to develop a kind of perception on China based on good understanding and correct understanding of China's strategic intentions. China does grow and it has the right to grow in strength, and so China will naturally become more powerful in terms of its economy, its military, and many other areas as well. But China's intention is basically to deliver a better life for the Chinese people. So we don't really have any hidden agenda. Overtaking the United States is not our goal. So if we have that in mind, the kind of mutually beneficial cooperation would be possible. We can talk about trade, economy, agriculture, law enforcement, even on cooperation in addressing global challenges. And people around the world do have strong expectations of the two countries to work together and other parties in the world to address the global challenges, which is a must for China and the United States.
China is not looking to create a new system. It's looking to make the current system work for everyone. Given this, the largest developing country and the largest developed country in the world have every reason to work together instead of falling into any so-called trap. Throughout this series, we'll be exploring topics related to President Xi and how governance is practiced in China. To stay up to date on the podcasts, visit the Beijing Review website, bjreview.com. Find us on YouTube or Spotify with the tag Beijing Review, or look for us where you get your podcasts. I'm Lu Yan in Beijing. Thanks for listening to the Governance Podcast. Bye for now.